why the people who raised you still run your life. Who is really in control? Not the version of you that walks into a room and commands attention. Not the version that looks composed, capable, and accomplished. But the version that sits alone at night, replaying decisions, second-guessing choices, wondering whether you're enough. Be honest with yourself for a moment. When you're about to make a bold move, whose voice do you hear first? Is it genuinely yours, or does it carry the tone of someone from your past? Why do you still hear those voices when the stakes are high? Why does choosing your own path come with a quiet sense of guilt? Why are you successful on paper, but not free in your spirit? Think about that carefully, because there are people in this room who have money, who have influence, who have every external marker of achievement, and yet somewhere beneath all of it, they are still asking for permission. Permission to live fully, permission to choose freely, permission simply to be. Let me take you deeper. You see, control doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always look like someone standing over you with demands. The most powerful form of control is silent. It is invisible. It lives inside your thoughts, disguised as practicality. It hides in your hesitations, dressed up as wisdom. It calls itself being responsible or doing the right thing. But here is the question that matters, right according to whom? Because every time you silence your own instincts to satisfy someone else's expectations, every time you shrink your vision to fit within someone else's comfort, every time you say maybe later to the life you actually want, something inside you diminishes quietly. No one around you notices, but you feel it. I want you to picture something. Imagine a cage, but not one made of iron or steel. A cage constructed from beliefs, built from words you heard before you were old enough to question them. Don't take risks. Be realistic. People like us don't do things like that. You grew up, but the cage grew with you. Your body matured, your responsibilities expanded, your world became larger, but your internal framework stayed fixed. You learned how to survive within certain parameters. What you never learned was how to be free from them. And here is what makes this particularly dangerous. You don't experience it as constraint. It feels normal. It feels like common sense. It feels unmistakably like you. Meanwhile, life keeps moving. Opportunities appear and you hesitate. Doors open and you overthink until they close again. Something pulls you back at the exact moment you're ready to step forward. You've called it caution. You've called it doubt. But what if neither of those labels is accurate? What if the hesitation you experience today is not your own fear, but inherited fear absorbed from someone else's unresolved life? Sit with that for a moment, because that single realization has the power to change everything. Here is where it becomes uncomfortable. Because many of you genuinely love the people who raised you. You respect them, you honor them, and that love is not misplaced. But love does not erase influence. Respect does not dissolve conditioning. The same people who protected you also shape the lens through which you see the world. Not with intention, not with malice, but with extraordinary power. And the result is that you are living a life shaped by decisions you never consciously made, following unspoken rules you never agreed to, chasing approval you no longer need but still crave. So I need you to ask yourself something most people are too uncomfortable to confront. If no one were watching, if there were no judgment, no expectations, no social calculus to manage, would you be living this same life? Or would you choose differently? Would you speak differently? Would you finally take the risk you've been deferring for years? Because that gap, the space between who you are and who you could be, that is precisely where control is hiding. There is a silent civil war happening inside you. One part wants to grow, to expand, to push past every boundary you've ever accepted. But another part feels guilty for wanting more at all. And that guilt is not accidental. It was taught. It was reinforced. So now every time you move toward evolution, you feel as though you're betraying something or someone. And rather than breaking free, you pull yourself back, not because you lack the ability, because you were trained to stay within certain lines. Here is the truth that may unsettle you. You grew older, but did you ever become truly independent? Not financially, not physically, but mentally, emotionally, psychologically. Because real independence is not about age, it is about ownership. Ownership of your thoughts, your decisions, and ultimately your life. And until you claim that ownership completely, someone else remains in control, even when they are nowhere near the room. So I ask you again, who is really in control? And more importantly, are you ready to find out? Now let's go deeper into something most people never question, even though it is shaping everything about them. Before you ever made your first independent decision, before you formed your first real opinion, your mind was already being written on, not by you, by your environment, by the conversations around you, the reactions you witnessed, the warnings you were given, the fears that were expressed in your presence. And the critical detail is this: you had no filter. You absorbed everything like a sponge placed in water. And what you absorbed became your operating system. Consider this. When you were young, you didn't sit down and conduct a rational analysis of money. You simply observed. You noticed how adults reacted when finances were discussed, the stress, the arguments, the sense of limitation. And without ever making a conscious decision, you formed beliefs. Money is difficult to attain. Wealth belongs to a different kind of person. It's safer not to want too much. And now, years later, you say you want success, but there's a contradiction running beneath the surface. Because part of your mind is still executing those original instructions, and it conflicts with every ambition you've tried to build on top of them. This isn't only about money. It's about how you see yourself, how you process failure, how you respond under pressure. Some of you were taught directly or through observation that mistakes are unacceptable. So now you hesitate to attempt things. You deliberate over every move. You delay action, not out of laziness, but because somewhere in your formation getting it wrong was treated as a serious threat. What appears to others as procrastination is, at its core, deeply embedded programming. And here is where it becomes even more significant. These beliefs don't identify themselves. They don't arrive with a label that says, this was installed in your childhood. Instead, they disguise themselves as your own voice. They sound like your judgment. They feel like your instincts. So when you say, I'm not ready, it feels completely true. When you say, this is too risky, it feels entirely logical. When you say, maybe this isn't for me, it feels honest. But what if it isn't? What if those thoughts aren't original, but inherited? Meanwhile, life keeps presenting you with invitations to grow, to expand, to become more. But every time you approach the edge of your comfort zone, something pulls you back. You interpret it as wisdom, as discernment. But in many cases, it's conditioning, the echo of voices from the past, trying to hold you in a familiar space, a safe space, a limited space. And the fundamental problem is this: growth does not happen in places that feel entirely safe. Let's be honest about something important, though. The people who shaped you were not trying to diminish you. Most of them were trying to protect you. They passed on what they knew, which was inevitably filtered through their own fears and their own limitations. And this matters because this conversation is not about blame, it is about awareness. Because once you have awareness, you have power. The power to question, the power to challenge, the power to choose something different. So I want you to examine your life with fresh eyes. Look at your patterns. Look at the decisions you keep repeating. Look at the areas where you remain stuck year after year. And instead of asking, what is wrong with me? Ask a different question entirely. Where did I learn this? Where did I learn to doubt my own instincts? Where did I learn to operate below my potential? Where did I learn to fear success, failure, and judgment simultaneously? Because when you trace it back honestly, you will discover something that is both liberating and sobering, most of your limitations were never yours to begin with. Understand this. Your mind is like a script that has been running for decades. Most people are living on autopilot, thinking the same thoughts, reacting in the same ways, staying within the same invisible boundaries, not because they consciously designed this life, but because it feels familiar. And familiarity is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. It has kept people stuck for entire lifetimes, not because they lacked intelligence or desire, but because familiar discomfort always felt safer than unfamiliar possibility. The truth ultimately is this: you did not choose your original mindset. It was handed to you. And until you examine it, until you question it with full honesty and take responsibility for rewriting it, you will continue to live a life that looks like yours on the outside while feeling controlled on the inside. The real question then is not whether you were programmed. You were. The question is, are you willing to reprogram yourself? This is where it gets uncomfortable in a way most people spend their lives avoiding. Because once you begin to see the conditioning, once you start recognizing the patterns, the first thing that shows up isn't freedom. It's conflict, deep internal tension. Because one part of you wants to change, to grow, to move forward, but another part feels that changing is a form of betrayal. Many of you are not stuck because you don't know what to do. You're stuck because of who it might affect if you actually do it. That is the loyalty trap. The silent agreement you made without words, without awareness. The agreement that says, I will not go so far beyond the people I came from that I no longer belong among them. And that agreement, however loving its origins, is quietly costing you your future. Think about it honestly. Why does guilt show up when you choose your own path? Why does success sometimes feel heavy rather than exhilarating? Why do you instinctively downplay your ambitions around certain people? It's not because you lack drive. It's because somewhere in your development, you were conditioned to associate advancement with disconnection, to believe that becoming more might mean losing something or someone that matters to you. Let's address expectations directly, both the spoken and the unspoken. Some of you were raised with explicit directives about what career to pursue, what success should look like, what kind of life was appropriate for someone from your background. Others experienced something more subtle, emotional expectations that carried just as much weight. Make us proud, don't embarrass the family, be responsible. These phrases may sound reasonable in isolation, but they accumulate. They create a kind of internal surveillance where every decision you make is filtered not just through your own judgment, but through an imagined audience of people whose approval you've been trained to need. There is also a fear that most people never say out loud. The fear that says, if I truly become who I'm meant to be, will I still be accepted? Will they understand me? Will they still see themselves in me? Will I still belong? And rather than risk confronting that discomfort, many people adjust themselves downward. They scale back the vision. They postpone the growth. Not because they lack the capability to rise, but because they're trying to preserve the connection. Here is the truth, though, and it's one that most people would rather not face. Real growth will create distance. Not necessarily physical distance, but intellectual, emotional, and sometimes spiritual distance. Because the way you begin to think, the standards you begin to set, the lens through which you start to see the world, these will not always align with the environment that formed you. That is not a failure of loyalty. That is the nature of genuine evolution. Many people spend their entire lives caught between two worlds. The world they are growing into and the world they came from. And that tension creates a kind of paralysis. One moment you feel clear, focused, ready to commit to the next level. The next moment you feel pulled back, uncertain, almost apologetic for having ambitions that exceed the expectations of your environment. That tug of war keeps people suspended in the middle, not fully growing, not fully at rest. Let's be direct about something deeper. Loyalty is a powerful and beautiful quality when it's healthy. But when loyalty demands that you suppress your potential, when it requires you to abandon your own truth, to live smaller than you were designed to live, it has crossed the line from love into limitation. And many people do not realize they are sacrificing their destiny on the altar of someone else's comfort. Ask yourself honestly, are you living a life that is true to you, or a life that keeps everyone around you comfortable? Because those two things are frequently in direct conflict. And the longer you avoid that question, the more of your own life you give away. The truth you must face is this: loyalty should not cost you your destiny. You can love people deeply and still choose your own path. You can respect where you came from and still decide where you're going. You can honor those who shaped you without allowing their ceiling to become yours. But that requires a particular kind of courage. Not the loud public kind, the quiet, deeply personal kind. The courage to say, I am profoundly grateful for what I was given, and I will not be permanently defined by it. The question then is no longer about awareness. You see the conditioning, you feel the conflict. The question is simply this: are you willing to choose growth even when growth is uncomfortable? This is where everything begins to shift in a way that will either liberate you or unsettle you, depending on how honest you're willing to be. Until this moment, you may have operated on the assumption that every thought in your mind is your own, that the voice you hear when you're making decisions, when doubt creeps in, when hesitation takes hold, is authentically, originally yours. But what if it isn't? What if that voice is simply a collection of echoes gathered over years, repeated until they became indistinguishable from your own perspective? Think about the last time you wanted to do something bold, something that required stepping outside the boundaries of the familiar. What was the first thought that arrived? Was it possibility or caution? Was it confidence or a subtle erosion of it? And where did that tone originate? Because if you listen carefully, really carefully, you may recognize it. It may carry the cadence of a parent, a teacher, a mentor, someone whose words reached you long before you had the capacity to evaluate them. And over time, rather than that voice staying external, it moved inward. It became yours, or so it seems. This is how conditioning operates at its deepest level. It doesn't remain outside you, it migrates inside. So now, instead of someone telling you don't take that risk, you tell yourself. Instead of someone saying you're not ready, you repeat it in your own interior monologue. The source disappears. The message remains. You stop questioning it. You begin to treat it as truth. But familiarity and accuracy are not the same thing. Something can feel completely true and still be entirely borrowed. This internal voice doesn't simply influence your thinking, it governs your behavior. It shapes your choices, calibrates your reactions, and decides on your behalf when to move and when to stop. And it does all of this quietly, without announcement, without drama. There's just a subtle resistance, a hesitation, a gentle suggestion that perhaps you should wait, reconsider, scale back. And you comply without recognizing that you've just ceded control. Let me make this undeniable. There are moments when your desire is clear, strong, unambiguous, and then almost immediately a counter voice appears. What if you fail? What will people think? What if you're not the right person for this? And just like that, your energy shifts. Your momentum slows. You step back, not because your desire disappeared, but because another voice overpowered it. Most people spend their entire lives responding to that voice as though it were an authority, as though it were wisdom. But consider this question and let it stay with you. If that voice has consistently pointed you toward limitation rather than possibility, toward safety rather than growth, toward the smaller version of yourself rather than the fuller one, why do you continue to treat it as your most reliable advisor? Not every thought that enters your mind deserves your agreement. Not every feeling that surfaces deserves your obedience. The fact that something appears in your consciousness does not make it true. It does not make it yours. It simply means it has been repeated with enough frequency to feel natural. And naturalness, as we have established, can be profoundly deceptive. Here is the practice that changes everything. The next time that voice speaks, don't simply accept it, observe it. Create a moment of space between the thought and your response to it. Ask, where did this come from? Does this thought serve who I'm becoming, or who I was conditioned to be? Is this mine or is this inherited? Because the moment you create that separation, the moment you stop automatically identifying with every passing thought, you begin to reclaim something essential. You begin to reclaim yourself. This is the foundation of genuine freedom. Not when your external circumstances become ideal, not when conditions align perfectly, but when you recognize with clarity that the voice in your head is not always speaking for you. And if it isn't speaking for you, you are not obligated to follow it. The question that remains is this: if you are not your thoughts, then who are you really? Let's bring this into your daily life in a way that is impossible to deflect. Because it is one thing to discuss voices, beliefs, and conditioning in the abstract. It is another to recognize how they are shaping your specific decisions right now, not years ago, but today. The choices you're making, the ones you're avoiding, the risks you're deferring, these are not random. They are patterned. Consider your career. Why did you choose the path you are on? Was it genuine alignment with who you are and what you care about? Or was it a path that made sense, that felt safe, that was accepted, that required the least amount of explanation to the people around you? And if right now you feel the pull towards something different, something more authentically yours, what is the actual barrier? Is it a lack of opportunity? Or is it the weight of someone's disappointment that you're not yet willing to carry? Look at your relationships, the way you give and withhold love, the way you set or consistently fail to set boundaries, the things you tolerate that you know you shouldn't. Many of you are not making fresh choices in your relationships. You are repeating dynamics you witnessed growing up because familiarity feels like home even when it's harmful. You learn to keep the peace at the expense of your own needs. You learned that your voice was secondary. You have called this your personality for years. It is in fact programming. Every time life presents you with an opportunity to expand, something predictable occurs. You pause. You construct elaborate reasons to wait. You analyze until the window closes. On the surface, this looks like careful deliberation. Underneath it is something far more specific, a need for validation, a need to feel before you act that someone whose opinion